Tonight, we will begin with a development that U.S. defense officials are following with growing concern, a development that has gained momentum far faster than many outside the intelligence agencies could have imagined. I'm not talking about months of public statements or easily observable troop concentrations, but about a shift that occurred within a compressed window of time, where indicators transformed, patterns of behavior changed, and warnings were given secretly in the corridors of the Pentagon long before the general public encountered a single headline. And when this shift became clear, Kyiv chose not to hesitate. Kyiv immediately acted with force. This narrative is not constructed from assumptions or unverified claims. It is concerned with how contemporary armed conflicts are monitored, assessed, and responded to in real time. It is concerned with what happens when a nuclear-capable nation adjusts its military posture in ways that defy any conventional explanation based on routine defensive operation. This raises the question of how Ukraine, struggling to maintain its sovereignty, has reached a point where it is not only tolerating increasing pressure, but actively working to eliminate it before it can fully take shape. According to assessments by United States intelligence agencies and allied intelligence services, what prompted the Pentagon to urgently communicate with its partners was not a single striking military maneuver, but an accumulation of changes that indicated something far more significant than standard military readiness procedures. Russian forces restructured deployment patterns for certain long-range strike capability. Strategic command communication networks exhibited unusual encrypted traffic patterns. We saw some military units, which typically produce observable logistical footprints, supply convoys, and maintenance operations, suddenly fall silent. To an untrained observer, the absence of visible activity might appear as a reduction in tension. We all know this. But for military intelligence analysts who have made their profession out of monitoring enemy behavior, silence is often the most revealing indicator. Defense officials have consistently argued that Russian military operations, even offensive ones, tend to follow identifiable rhythms. Preparations for offensive actions typically produce detectable signs. Increased fuel deliveries, maintenance crews working around the clock, increased encrypted communications, movement of ammunitions, stockpiles. These are some of the things we see. The sudden disappearance of these signs from the intelligence landscape usually indicates a shift in operational planning to a more compartmentalized, tightly guarded phase. We all know this shift caused serious concern within the intelligence community in Washington. And for those trained to read these patterns, the implications were clear. The Pentagon leadership didn't immediately release its findings to the press. Instead, they followed established protocols designed precisely for such situations. Do you think this is accurate? They worked to corroborate what they saw. They compared satellite imagery with signals intelligence. They compared data from cyber surveillance systems with information gathered from human sources. They consulted with intelligence partners in NATO member countries, from GCHQ in the UK to DGSE in France, from German intelligence to the military intelligence services of Poland and the Baltic states. And when multiple independent intelligence sources arrived at the same disturbing conclusion, the decision was made to issue a formal warning. This warning was transmitted through secure diplomatic and military channels to NATO headquarters in Brussels and directly to the Ukrainian military and political leadership in Kyiv. The language used was deliberately tailored, but fundamentally clear. All of the observed Russian military activity did not align with any reasonable defensive justification. The immediate concern was not that the offensive had already begun, but that Russia appeared to be systematically creating multiple options for a significant escalation. These options could be activated with minimal warning once a decision was made. This meant the intelligence agency worked exactly as designed, transforming raw data into actionable warnings. Isn't what happened in the hours and days following this warning fundamentally different from the countless previous moments of tension throughout this ongoing conflict? Ukraine did not adopt a wait-and-see approach. Ukraine did not engage in lengthy discussions about how to respond if Moscow ultimately chose one path of escalation over another. It never did. Acting on intelligence, the Ukrainian military leadership decided to take preemptive action, targeting critical infrastructure elements that, if allowed to remain operational, would enable further escalation. This was not a symbolic gesture or a proportionate retaliation for previous attack. This was a calculated preemption. Ukrainian defense officials publicly announced that they conducted coordinated military operations against infrastructure directly linked to Russian operational capabilities in the occupied territories, and in some cases against targets located further inland in areas used to support the broader war effort. These operations focused on logistical networks, communication infrastructure, and operational support facilities rather than civilian settlements. According to official Ukrainian government statements, the stated goal was to systematically reduce Russia's capacity to rapidly intensify military pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. The speed and precision of Ukraine's response demonstrated the dramatic improvement in the country's military capabilities since the early days of this conflict. Western defense analysts, reviewing current satellite imagery and open-source intelligence data, note that the attacks appear fundamentally consistent with the stated defensive objective. Fuel depots supplying forward operating bases, critical communications relay points coordinating between different military units, and airfield facilities supporting the operations of both manned and unmanned aerial vehicles were among the reported targets. Compiling full damage assessments takes time, and independent verification through multiple intelligence sources is still ongoing. But preliminary indications suggest the operations were effective enough to force Russian military planners to reassess their urgent operational timeline. From the Pentagon's analytical perspective, this represented the kind of response they hoped for to deter further escalation and avoid triggering uncontrolled retaliation that could escalate into something far more dangerous. U.S. officials have consistently and repeatedly emphasized, both in public statements and private diplomatic communications, that their strategic goal is to prevent a conflict by making it clear that destabilizing military moves will be detected, understood, and countered. The calculation here is delicate but critical. It requires determination to avoid catastrophic miscalculation. What do you find striking when you examine the timeline? Of course, it's the speed at which this entire process unfolded. Intelligence gathering, warning dissemination, coordination with Ukrainian forces, and Ukraine's operational response all happened within an extremely short time frame. The speed reflects something fundamental about how deeply this conflict has evolved. This isn't the measured, methodical diplomacy that characterized Cold War conflicts. This isn't a situation where weeks of negotiations preceded military decisions. This is a conflict environment where critical decisions are formulated and implemented based on intelligence analyzed and acted upon in real time, sometimes within hours, sometimes minutes. Pentagon officials, speaking to reporters on condition of anonymity, described the situation as essentially a test. They spoke of a test not announced through public speeches or diplomatic initiatives, but one embedded directly in military actions and response. The questions being tested were simple, but truly crucial. Was the Western alliance still closely monitoring Russian military behavior? If pressure indicators pointed to an imminent escalation, would Ukraine hesitate? Would internal political debates, common in democratic societies, lead to delays that adversaries could exploit? The answers to these questions quickly emerged. Washington activated urgent consultation mechanisms with key NATO allies. Intelligence sharing protocols, normally requiring multiple layers of approval, were accelerated. And Ukraine clearly demonstrated its ability and resolve to act decisively when it assessed a direct threat to its security. This combination of factors, timely intelligence, rapid allied coordination, and Ukraine's willingness to conduct preemptive operations, is something the Russian leadership must incorporate into its future strategic calculation. It is important to clearly understand what this development means and does not mean. There is no publicly available evidence that Russia has completely abandoned strategic restraint or that a major escalation on all fronts is now inevitable. But there is no doubt that the overall risk environment has intensified measurably. The Russian leadership is under pressure from many directions, sometimes contradictory. There is the pressure of a prolonged military operation that has failed to achieve its initial goals. There is the economic pressure resulting from ongoing international sanctions and the redirection of resources towards military production. There are competing aspirations from different groups within Russia's own political apparatus and security institutions, each with different priorities and different assessments of what constitutes success. Historical analysis of military conflict shows that moments characterized by such pressures are particularly dangerous because leaders feel not secure in their positions, but rather constrained and uncertain. When perceived options begin to dwindle and the gap between stated goals and achievable outcomes widens, the temptation to take significant risks, to undertake dramatic action that could break the perceived impasse, can increase considerably. This psychological dynamic is precisely why U.S. officials are exhibiting such careful discipline in their public discourse, characterizing Russian military actions as inconsistent with defensive intentions and avoiding the use of more provocative terminology that could eliminate diplomatic options or create pressures for escalation. This careful adjustment of language is extremely important. Words shape perceptions, perceptions influence decisions, and in a nuclear arms race, decisions carry existential weight. The Pentagon understands that every public statement becomes part of a strategic calculation, analyzed in Moscow for signs of weakness or resolve, and scrutinized by allies for evidence of commitment or hesitation. Meanwhile, Ukraine's political leadership has explicitly stated its military response as a defensive necessity rather than an act of aggression, serving multiple strategic audiences simultaneously, reassuring domestic public opinion while signaling restraint to international partners. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, in a speech to the Ukrainian people, stressed that Ukraine will not adopt a passive stance waiting for potential threats to escalate into actual attack. Ukraine reiterated and demonstrated its determination that the primary goal of its military actions is to protect Ukrainian citizens and prevent further suffering, and not to expand the geographical scope of the conflict. Another dimension that significantly complicates this particular moment is Russia's broader range of activity, observable simultaneously in multiple areas. In addition to shifts in military posture that have triggered Pentagon concern, intelligence agencies have documented an increase in cyber operations targeting critical infrastructure in Ukraine and some NATO member countries, attempts to infiltrate energy grid systems, probe attacks on financial networks, and sophisticated disinformation campaigns. They have tracked intensified information warfare campaigns designed to weaken Western support for Ukraine and create division, using social media platforms, funding sympathetic media outlets, and exacerbating existing political divisions in democratic society. It is also worth noting that they have recorded increased naval activity in disputed maritime areas, including the Black Sea and Baltic approaches, submarine movements that strain NATO response times, and surface ship deployments that challenge established maritime boundaries. None of these activities, taken in isolation, may trigger a strategic alarm. Taken collectively as elements of a coordinated strategy, it demonstrates a deliberate multidimensional pressure campaign designed to overcome defense systems purely through complexity. Western intelligence agencies have begun monitoring Russia's military and strategic behavior almost continuously across all relevant areas. Analysts are not only examining whether forces are moving from one place to another, but are also trying to understand intentions from patterns of behavior. Are military units returning to their previous barracks positions or remaining deployed forward? Are communication patterns normalizing towards peacetime levels or remaining at a high level? Is the rhetorical escalation in official Russian statements continuing to intensify or beginning to decrease? So far, the intelligence picture is mixed, with some elements remaining unclear. Some indicators have remained high above normal level. Others appear to have temporarily paused or decreased in intensity. This uncertainty, the continued ambiguity about the next moves, constitutes part of the strategic challenge. Strategic signaling between rivals often relies on ambiguity, creating situations where rivals have to allocate resources to counter multiple possible scenarios without knowing which one will materialize. But Ukraine's swift operational response managed to block or at least significantly complicate at least some of the potential paths to escalation. For Pentagon leadership and the broader U.S. defense establishment, this event actually reinforces a crucial strategic lesson that has increasingly shaped American policy throughout this conflict. Early warning and rapid intelligence coordination can make the difference between deterring escalation and confronting it once it has begun. Despite objections from more cautious voices concerned about protecting intelligence sources and methods, defense officials have consistently argued that rapidly sharing actionable intelligence, even at the risk of revealing how it was obtained, can prevent casualties and avert larger conflict. This particular event seems to validate this approach, demonstrating the tangible security benefits of rapid intelligence sharing. It also underscores how operationally integrated Ukraine is with Western defense and intelligence network. The ability to receive complex intelligence, interpret it accurately within the appropriate operational context, develop effective intervention plans, coordinate it across multiple military units, and execute those plans with precision requires far more than mere courage or determination. This requires advanced command and control systems, comprehensive professional military training, and most importantly, institutional trust that develops only through sustained cooperation over time. This level of integration did not exist before this conflict began. Now it exists thanks to deliberate and continuous investment in developing these relationships and capabilities. As of this evening, there are no signs or indications that NATO forces are preparing for direct military intervention in the conflict. Alliance officials have always made it clear that NATO's stance is fundamentally defensive, focused on protecting alliance territory and not engaging in operations beyond those borders. However, they have also made it equally clear that destabilizing actions carried out near NATO territory or operations involving strategic assets that could threaten alliance members will be heavily scrutinized and will have consequences. The coming days will be critical in determining whether this event represents a temporary escalation of tension that will later subside or the beginning of a more permanent and destabilizing phase in the conflict. A conclusion can already be reached with certainty. The assumption that Ukraine could be forced into strategic passivity through military intimidation no longer aligns with observable reality. The assumption that Western interest in this conflict would inevitably dissipate at critical moments also appears to have been disproven. We are witnessing a conflict where power is increasingly measured not only by traditional criteria, but also by information superiority, speed of decision-making, and demonstrated resolve. Tonight's sequence of events demonstrates how these elements interact with traditional military capabilities, and how this can either restrain or accelerate escalation. The Kremlin has not offered detailed public explanations for the military activities that have caused concern in Washington. This silence is also being analyzed. Silence from rival leadership could indicate negotiation, internal disagreement, or strategic recalculation. Intelligence analysts will be watching to see if Russian forces adjust their positions, if command communications normalize, and whether the broader pattern of pressure continues or eases. And we will continue to closely monitor these developments, because what happens next is important not only for Ukraine or Russia, but also for the broader framework of international norms governing how nations treat each other. Whether these norms will hold true or be further eroded under pressure will depend in part on how the international community responds to moments like these. Stay tuned for updates